of course, politics comes to mind when we say, I don't like being lied to. And it seems these days, right, we watch flat out lies, something, we know something that we even know is a lie as they're saying it, or even if they say something and later it comes out that it's a lie, that there was something false about it. And I hate it, and it's frustrating. But what's more frustrating is when there's this idea that now I'm crazy because I'm mad that there's the lie there, right? Or I'm upset, or that this lie isn't necessarily, that it's almost like it's my fault you lied to me. I don't know. I don't get this idea out there, but we have this notion that it's some sort of accepted part of our world that we get lied to on the political sphere. But I don't like it. Again, you got to take that back to our personal sphere. I just don't like the idea that you'll look at me and you'll tell me something knowing that it's false, and then act like I'm crazy when I find out that it's not true, or I'm the bad guy when I find out it's not true. And so when Jesus comes to us in Matthew chapter 5 verse 33, he says this. He says, "Again, you have heard that it was said of those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn." Seems like a pretty reasonable thing, right? What's wrong with the idea that if you say you're going to do something, you should do it? If you make the oath, if you tell if you say something like, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and you tell the Lord that, what is wrong with wanting to keep our oaths, our promises, our vows? There's even biblical precedent to this. If you look back at Numbers chapter 30, verse 2, it says, "If a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." So God said that, right? If you make a vow, you should keep that vow. It's an important part of the process of the relationship with God, right? It even says it in Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse, 23 and verse 21 through 23 says, "If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay in fulfilling it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. You shall be careful to do what has passed your lips, for you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth." So again, what's wrong with this idea? Why is Jesus is saying, you've heard that, and as we know in our study of this passage, we know that when Jesus says you've heard that, he's about to say something, that there's something wrong with it, right? There's something that might not be exactly right with that principle. Well, here's a thought. Here's just a lesson from history, right? If we look at the story of Japheth in Judges chapter 11, doesn't work out really well for him when he vows something to the Lord and then fulfills it. Look with me at Judges chapter 11, verse 29. So Japheth is a judge. Just to give you some background, he's the judge in Israel. He is having mighty victories. He's really coming down the pike of his family history. He's got a very tumultuous family history, to put it mildly. When we get to this story, when we get to verse 29, he's having a victory. He's doing it, and he comes in and he'll make a vow. So let's go ahead and read that in verse 29. It says, "Then the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and passed on to Mizpah and Gilead. And from Mizpah of Gilead he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, and said, If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doers of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the Ammonites, shall be of the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering." That just sounds like all sorts of good ideas, doesn't it? Anything that comes out of my door is going to be a burnt offering. Well, here's what it says. It continues on. "So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hands, and he struck them from Aroer to the neighbor of Minnith," and I'm sure I'm butchering all of these, but that's okay, "20 cities, and as far as Abel Kermin, with a great blow, so the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah. And here's where it gets tragic. And behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. She was his only child. Beside her he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble for me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. I'm going to hold it right there. Because if ever there was a story in the Bible that resonates with me, it's this one right here, right? I have one only daughter, and if I make some sort of vow that would lead me to have to give her as a burnt offering to the Lord, I don't feel like my exclamation would be, you have brought me very low. That just doesn't seem to quite cut the jib of what we're talking about here, right? It just doesn't seem to quite capture the feeling. I would be so mournful and sorrowful. I would do anything. I'd probably do it to me before I did it to her, right? Like that would be. Is there any way that I could do it to me instead, right? That would be the bargain I would try to find here. And so yeah, so that certainly resonates with me on that. And so here's what happens from here in verse 36, and it says, "And she said to him, My father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, and now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, on the Ammonites." So she said to her father, Let this thing be done to me. Let me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down the mountains and weep for my virginity, and I and my companions. And so he said, Go then. And he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, and she and her companions, and wept for her virginity on the mountains. And at the end of 2 months she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. She had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament as for the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in the year. Does that not turn your stomach just a little bit? It should. It should turn your stomach a little bit that Jephthah went through with that. And I think when we come to the point where Jesus is saying about this idea of oaths, this idea of making a promise to God, that there's a reality that sometimes we make a rash vow, and this is perfect example that sometimes we just make rash vows. We make vows that we don't quite understand. We don't quite understand what to do with it. But here's the thing, and Jephthah, and really you'd think that Jephthah would know this, being a judge over Israel, right? He would be one who might know the word of the Lord better than the people around him. But in Leviticus chapter 5, there's actually a provision in the law for such a vow as this, right? It says in 5:4-6, it says, Or as if anyone utters with his lips a rash oath to do evil or to do good, any sort of rash oath the people swear, and it is hidden from him, when he comes to know it and he realizes his guilt of any of these, when he realizes his guilt in any of these and confesses the sin he has committed, he shall bring to the Lord at his compensation for the sin that he has committed a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat, for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him for his sin. So you would think that Jephthah, right, who has made this rash vow, would know that in Leviticus there's a provision for a rash vow. There was actually a way out. There was a way in which he could have saved his daughter and didn't even take his own life, right? You'd think he'd know it, and if nothing else, you'd think someone around him would have said, Oh, hey, Jephthah, before you do that, before you get there, look, there's this provision over here. There's this part in God's word that says, don't do it here. This is a sin to make a rash vow, and we have a way out, right? Somebody should have said something, and yet they didn't. And then that's what happened. And Jephthah ended up killing his only daughter, ended up sacrificing her as if that's what God wanted. And that's not, I don't think, what God wants. And I think that's apparent when we come back to Matthew chapter 5. Because when we come back to Matthew chapter 5, as Jesus says, you've heard it said this way, then there's something to that Jesus says, I don't want it to be that way. There's something that God didn't intend for it to be such a way. And so as we continue in this statement, right, he says in verse 34, But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Pause there for a second. We're going to talk about that. It says, so don't make an oath at all. Just don't do it. there's not a value in taking an oath, right? And even that's kind of clear as you look at the Old Testament, as the Old Testament says, hey, if you're going to make an oath, you're going to be required of that oath. Even Deuteronomy had said, you're not going to be in trouble if you don't make oaths. We read that. It's you're not going to make trouble. You're not going to be in trouble. You're not going to sin if you don't make oaths at all. That's not a bad thing. But if you do, you better be careful. And if you make a rash vow, Leviticus says it's a sin to do that, and here's the compensation for that sin. It's the idea is that Jesus is basically saying, like, just don't do it. Just don't make that a part of your walk. Don't make that a part of your makeup and character that you make oaths. And so let me tell you a little something about making oaths and what that looks like. I for a time, and I've told you guys this many times, and many stories come out of this experience. I worked with a halfway house out in Lubbock, where you're working with prisoners and you're working with, with those who are, all sorts of problems, all sorts of trying to get around the rules, and you have to catch them in things. And I had to be the one to investigate whenever they got in trouble, all those kinds of things. And here's the thing. Here's the thing to look at. When you are investigating an issue with a resident there, and even no matter how there's some charges like drug use. Those are the things that'll kind of end your program. There's other things like you took an extra thing at dinner, or you had something in your locker. You weren't supposed to have that. It goes from the trivial to the pretty serious. And here's the thing: whenever you're investigating it, they tell you all sorts of stories. Boo-hoo, I needed this, or I didn't get as much last time, or or da-da-da, or he made me, or I didn't know, or whatever. All sorts of sob stories. But here's the thing that you look out for. Because if someone tells you, I swear I didn't do it, I swear on all that I have, or I swear on my mother, or I swear on anything. If they tell you that, they did it. They did it. That is like admitting your guilt right there. If they swear by anything, they did exactly what they're being accused of. Whether you have them dead to rights or not, you can be rest assured that they did exactly what this is. And the idea of oaths is just, it's such a phony thing to say. I swear I'll do this. Why do we have to put any sort of thing on your word to be able to, to prove that you're going to do what you say you do? A solid example of this is if you have ever seen this movie and you've seen this line that you have my word and it's stronger than oak, right? It's just that, oh yeah, my word is strong. If you've never seen this movie, he immediately breaks his word. He says, you have my word and it's stronger than oak. And the very first thing he does is he breaks his word. That's the whole idea. And we think of it like it's, pinky promise, right? It's kind of a goofy thing. Oh, did you pinky promise on it? Oh, yeah, okay, all right. Well, let's keep our pinky promise. We think of it as some sort of dorky thing that you've done some sort of oath or promise or something like that. And if that's the case, if you've done something like that, then we can just laugh it off and we don't have to really do that. It's just a way to get someone to. But the reality is it is a blatant lie, right? Back to that first thing I said. I hate being lied to. I'm pretty sure God hates being lied to. I'm pretty sure when we say we're going to do something for him and we put on all these airs and all these great big things that says, yeah, Lord, I'm going to do exactly this for you. I'm going to do this no matter what. And when we don't come through with it, I'm pretty sure God doesn't like that. Even if he knows that, yeah, I know they're never going to do that. I know that's never going to happen. Or I know something's going to get in the way of it. Even if God knows that sort of thing, right? He doesn't like that in our character. He doesn't like that in the way we do. And this, when we look at this, Jesus makes that, I think, a little more abundantly clear when we look over at Matthew chapter 23. Because, and I want you to just compare the tones of these two moments for a second. If we look at the Sermon on the Mount, right, Jesus is telling some things to the people who are following him. He's trying to give them direction and teaching and guidance. He's really like, hey, hey, I know you can do this, and I want to bring you to this, right? I want you guys to understand what it means to follow me. When we get to chapter 23, he's calling out the Pharisees, and he's saying, woe is you, right? He's saying, woe is you for the thing you do. This tone is pretty emphatically enraged at what the Pharisees do. So I want you to kind of grasp that tone as we get into what he's saying here in chapter 23, verse 16 through 23. Sorry, 16 through 22. Read with me. It says, woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. And so he's calling out the Pharisees on this concept of oath-taking, that you've got it backwards. You've got it completely and utterly backwards. The thing that's important to them is the gold and the gift and the stuff that we bring to God, or the stuff that is God's things. And Jesus is saying, you have that so utterly backward because the only thing that makes those things great is because of who it is they're giving it to, or who it belongs to, or who it is that dwells there. And we have no understanding or comprehension of the value of the one in whom these things are sacred for. And when he's calling out the Pharisees here on oath-taking, there's this idea that when you take these oaths and you're finicky and you play these games about whether these oaths are right or not, when you play these games about whether you can keep that oath or not that oath, or you have to keep that word but not that word, when you play all these games, you're neglecting God, you're neglecting the value of God, and you are neglecting the value of God among the people. The people aren't seeing and aren't hearing what value God brings to the table. Because it's His table, it's His world, it's His stuff, it's all of that, and He dwells in it. And He's the sacred one. And so this idea of oath-taking, this idea of taking these oaths and then them falling flat, taking these oaths and disvaluing them, it is a cosmic joke to the Lord. It is a devaluing of the one in whom we profess to serve. God is saying that I think God's kind of angry about that. I think we don't understand that when we devalue God to people, that's a huge deal. When we devalue our word, it devalues his reputation when His people are so devaluing their word. Look at James chapter 4. Because when we see this concept of making these vows and making rash or otherwise, we make these vows, Jesus is saying don't do it. It doesn't have any value. It's not good for you. You have no control, right? He says you can't even make the hairs on your head white or black. So why are you swearing by your head, right? Well, James tells us here, you have no control. Look at verse 13 of chapter 4. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will be such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. It is, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. So James is illustrating here this idea that when we say, this is going to happen, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to, in oath taking or just in our planning, the whole idea is when I say this is how things are going to work out, this is how it's going to be, I'm going to do this way. That is an arrogant statement to think you have any clue how tomorrow or any other day is going to look, right? That is your arrogance to think that you know how it's all going to work out. And he's saying that arrogance is evil. It is evil. And so with that, his solution to this is first is to put that into the hands of the Lord. So it's not evil to make plans, but you better make sure that you're giving that to the Lord. You better make sure that God is able to sign off and check your plan off, right? That God is a part of that, because God is the one who has control of those things. God is the one who's in control. And so with that, as all of that boasting is evil, and if we're not putting those things in the hands of the Lord, right, he's saying here the solution is, if you don't do what is right, that's sin. You know this is the right thing to do, and you don't do it, that's a wrong thing. That's sin. And so, again, back to the solution then, is that when I see what I know I'm supposed to do, when I see what I'm supposed to do, then I should be pretty direct and resolute to do that thing. That's all it takes. I see what I'm supposed to do, I do that thing. I see what I'm not supposed to do, I don't do it, right? So with that, right, we got to look back at what Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 5, right? Because Jesus gives us that final idea here. And he says in verse 37, "Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than that comes from evil." Anything more than that comes from evil. And so the idea here is simply keep your word. Keep your word. If you say you're going to do something, you don't need to jazz it up with any oaths, with any decrees about how solid or good or right your word is. Just be the person who keeps their word. It's funny because this is why politics is such an easy example of this, right? Because politics all the time, it's I'm going to say this, I'm going to do this, and when we just watch 5 seconds later and they break it. We watch it 5 seconds later and we see that. And politics is an easy target for this. But here's the thing, is that when we look at that, we have a kind of an acceptance that's how politics is. And somehow or another, that means it's okay in our world too. Somehow that's okay. Politicians do it, and they are our leaders, so we can play those same games amongst ourselves. We can play those same games with our word. We can say, that I'm going to do that thing, and then if I break it, it's not that big a deal. It's not that bad. And there's one more story that Jesus tells I want to look at in Matthew chapter 21. In Matthew chapter 21, 28 through 32. Wow. If I can find it. Here we go. 21, 28 through 32. It says this. "What do you think? A man had 2 sons, and he went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' And he answered, 'I will not.' But afterward he changed his mind and went. And he went to the other son and said the same, and he answered, 'I go, sir,' but did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father?" And they said, "The first." And Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw it, you did not afterward change your minds and believe him." And I want to address this in a way that a little bit of confession here to you. You may have noticed this about me. If you haven't, well, this is something that's true about me. Is a lot of times I am very keen to say, I'll do that for you, no problem. Yeah, let me take care of this. Let me take care of that. And then a lot of times I forget, because that's the kind of disorganized person I am. Okay, so for that I apologize. It's not my intention not to do things for you. It is my intention to be that way. But he's calling out a point here, right? And this is a point that we need to be careful of, is that intention really doesn't even matter. The intention of my heart is to do the things for you. The intention of our hearts might be, I'm making an oath that says, I'm going to do that, and I really want you to know that I'm honest and I'm sincere. It's the action that matters. It's the action that matters. The one who says no actually goes out and does what he's commanded to do, even after he said no. And he's the one who's commended here. The one who says yes and doesn't do it, is one sitting on a really big problem. Is one who's sitting on a big problem on how he acts on his word. Is that if he's going to say yes and then doesn't do it, he's being called out as you didn't do what was commanded. You might have had all great intention, but you didn't do. And that's the important thing when we talk about keeping our word. Keeping our word is important because it's not about giving a nice word. It's not about giving a nice, pleasant, promise to the other person. It's about fulfilling and walking through on that promise. And most importantly, when we talk about our relationship with God, it's about fulfilling our end of the bargain. We are in a bargain with God. When we're in covenant with Him, that's what it is. That's our bargain. And when we come together and we say, man, I am so grateful for Jesus. I am so grateful for the blood He shed. I'm so grateful for the gift of that salvation. I'm so grateful what that means for me. But when we are grateful for that, we can't forget the fact that in order to be in relationship, in order to have that gift, we've got to fulfill our end of the bargain. And that end of the bargain is that we are slaves to righteousness, as Romans 6 tells us. We are slaves to the path in which God gives. That means that God is the one who directs me, and God is commanding me in all different manner of facets of life. And I have to be aware of that, and I have to keep my end of the bargain. No manner of promises, no manner of IOUs, no manner of hopes and good intentions are going to cause me to be the one who fulfills my end of the bargain. Keep your word. Be one who keeps your word. And here's the thing, if we love the one in whom has given us this bargain, who has given us the blood of His Son, if we love Him, then keeping His word shouldn't be difficult. He promises it's not difficult. He promises that it's not, it's challenging. Okay, don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean it doesn't have hardships. But to be able to keep our words, to be able to keep commandment with Him, to be able to keep in that covenant and keep our end of things, He promises He gives us everything we need to be able to do that. He gives us everything we need in order to accomplish and fulfill and keep our word. This morning, that starts with our relationship with Christ. If you want to be in relationship with Him, if you want to be someone who keeps your word, if you want to be able to, it starts with walking with Him and accepting that through baptism, putting on the death of Christ, being buried with Him, and being raised to that newness of life. That's how we begin this journey of being people who keep our words. But then we go forth, and when we see what God says, we don't need to fancy up or jazz up what we say. We don't need to put some sort of character on our words. We just need to be disciples with the integrity that says, if I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do that thing. And if I say I'm not going to do something, I'm not going to do that thing. Let's be people of character. Let's hold those oaths. Not by making oaths, but holding our word and holding those things true, and that be the content of our character this morning. If there's anything else we can do for you, if there's any way we can help you by talking, praying, studying, let us know this morning as we stand and we sing.